The wind howled across the red plains of Varkash like a wounded beast. Dust storms rolled across the horizon in violent waves, turning the alien landscape into a shifting sea of crimson sand. Jagged stone pillars rose from the ground like broken teeth, and between them stretched the territory of one of the galaxy's most feared predator species. The Carthari. To most civilizations, the Carthari were not animals. They were nightmares. Standing nearly 3 meters tall on powerful hind legs, their bodies were covered in dark armored scales, and rows of bone, like spikes, ran along their backs. Their jaws were wide and filled with curved hunting teeth, and their glowing amber eyes could track movement from kilometers away. But the most terrifying part wasn't their strength. It was their intelligence. The Carthari hunted in organized packs led by a single alpha, and their territories were protected with ruthless precision. Even heavily armed military patrols avoided their hunting grounds, which was why Lieutenant Mara Reyes had no business being there. Her boots crunched softly against the hardened red soil as she moved through the canyon, one hand resting on the pulse rifle slung across her chest. The human exploration team she had been assigned to had long since retreated to their orbiting vessel. Official orders had been clear: observe from a distance. Do not engage, do not approach, but Mara had ignored the last part, because something had been wrong. Earlier that morning, the long-range scanners had picked up unusual activity deep within the canyon system. The Carthari pack had been moving in tight defensive patterns, and several large predators had been spotted circling one particular rock formation. Mara had seen enough war zones and wildlife documentaries to recognize what that meant. Something weak was in the middle, something vulnerable, and where predators gathered like that, death usually followed. She crouched behind a slab of stone and slowly lifted a small scanner. The display flickered. Multiple heat signatures, large ones, very large ones, and one much smaller. Mara's brow tightened. Great, she muttered under her breath. A cub. The Carthari breeding cycles were rarely observed. In fact, most scientific data about their young was theoretical, which meant if a cub was in danger, this was the worst possible place to be. Still, curiosity pushed her forward. Carefully, silently, Mara climbed the ridge and looked down into the canyon basin. Her breath caught. 7 adult Carthari stood in a wide circle. Their massive bodies shifted restlessly as they snarled and paced around a cluster of rocks. Clawed feet scraped against stone. Their tails lashed through the air like whips, and in the middle of them, a cub. It was small compared to the adults, barely the size of a large dog. Its scales were softer and lighter in color, and one of its hind legs trembled as it tried to stand. The cub stumbled, collapsed. A harsh growl rippled through the circle. Mara's heart sank. The adults weren't protecting it. They were judging it. Among predator species across the galaxy, weakness in offspring often meant death. Nature didn't tolerate the fragile. One of the adults stepped closer. A towering female with jagged scars across her armored neck. She lowered her massive head toward the cub and let out a low rumbling snarl. The cub whimpered. It tried to crawl away. Its injured leg dragged uselessly behind it. The female opened her jaws, and Mara moved. "Hey!" Her voice echoed across the canyon before her brain could stop it. 7 enormous predator heads snapped upward. Amber eyes locked onto her. The silence that followed felt like the universe itself had stopped breathing. Mara slowly stepped down the rocky slope, pulse hammering in her chest. "Yeah," she said nervously. "Bad timing." "I know." The cub let out a small frightened chirp. The female Carthari snarled and stepped forward, muscles rippling beneath her armored hide. Mara raised her hands. She didn't point her rifle. If she fired, the entire pack would tear her apart before she got a second shot. Instead, she walked straight toward the cub. The predators watched. Every step she took should have been suicide, but something strange happened. They didn't attack. They simply watched. Mara knelt beside the cub. Up close, the injury was obvious. The back leg had been badly twisted, possibly broken. The cub's scales were scraped raw from dragging itself across the stone. "Easy," she whispered softly. The cub flinched when her hand moved toward it. Then it sniffed the air. Its glowing eyes studied her face. Slowly, carefully, Mara pulled a small medical wrap from her utility pack. Behind her, a deep, rumbling growl echoed through the canyon. The Alpha had arrived. The ground trembled under the weight of his steps. Mara turned slightly. The Alpha Carthari was enormous, nearly 4 meters tall when fully upright. His scales were darker than the others, almost black, and his head carried a crown of long bone spines that marked him as the leader of the pack. He stopped only a few meters away. His eyes burned like twin suns. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Mara looked back at the cub. "If you're gonna eat me," she muttered quietly, "at least let me finish this first." She wrapped the injured leg carefully. The cub hissed at first, but when the pressure stabilized the limb, its body relaxed. A soft chirping sound escaped its throat. Mara smiled slightly. "There you go." Behind her, the Alpha lowered his head. The entire pack went silent. The massive predator stepped forward. 1 step. 2. Mara slowly turned. She expected teeth, claws, death. Instead, the Alpha did something no one in the galaxy had ever recorded. He lowered his massive head and bowed. The rest of the pack followed instantly. 7 deadly predators dropped into submission. Mara blinked. "Wait," she whispered. The cub chirped again and nudged her leg affectionately. The Alpha lifted his head slightly and released a deep, resonating call. It echoed across the canyon like thunder. Moments later, shapes began emerging from the cliffs. More Carthari, dozens of them. Warriors, hunters. They approached cautiously, watching the strange human standing beside the cub. The Alpha turned toward them and let out another powerful call. Every predator in the canyon immediately lowered themselves. A wave of submission spread across the valley. Mara stared in stunned disbelief. "What did I just do?" The cub waddled closer and pressed its head against her knee. The Alpha watched quietly, and for the first time, Mara understood. Among the Carthari, strength was not just measured in claws. It was measured in protection. The Alpha had tested the cub. If it could survive on its own, it would live. If not, it would be culled. But Mara had done something else. She had protected the weak when she had no reason to. No pack loyalty, no survival benefit. Just compassion. To the Carthari. That was the mark of an Alpha. The massive predator stepped closer. Mara held her breath. He lowered his head until his armored brow touched the ground in front of her. Then the Alpha spoke, not in words, but in a deep, vibrating sound that resonated through the air. The cub chirped happily beside her, and across the canyon, the entire Carthari pack bowed again. Far above them, orbiting scanners aboard the human research vessel captured the moment. The footage would soon send shockwaves across the galaxy. Because on that day, in a dusty canyon on a distant world, humanity had unknowingly gained something no civilization had ever achieved before. The loyalty of the Carthari. And at Mara's feet, the once helpless cub sat proudly beside the strange new Alpha it had chosen. A human,